Hello and welcome back. Our third session today is titled New Concepts and Theoretical Imperatives, Coloniality, Decoloniality, and Their Aftermath. It's a pleasure to welcome our panelists, Muriam Haleh Davis, Assistant Professor, Department of History, University of California, Santa Cruz, Walter Mignolo, Distinguished William H. Wannamaker Professor, Romance Studies and Professor Literature, Duke University, who will be joining us via Zoom, and Françoise Vergès, Professor, Cultural Studies, the Africa Institute. The panel is moderated by Premesh Lalu, Professor of History, the Africa Institute. I'd now like to hand over to you, Premesh.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to make sure that Walter has joined us. Is he with us? Yeah. Okay. So welcome to this wonderfully assembled panel. We have three speakers, as we've just heard. I'm going to start us off right away. So let's just start with Muriam. If you don't mind, you can use the podium here, and then we'll pose some general questions and open up for a Q&A. Okay. So 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Thank you all for coming back from lunch. I know that's never an easy thing to do. I'm delighted to be here and wanting to thank our hosts for their hospitality. It's really an honor and quite intimidating to be in this company, in this crowd. So I'm really excited for the discussion and have already learned a lot over the past few days. So as I was preparing this talk, I've been thinking a lot about the anniversary of the 2011 uprisings in the region, and of course the most recent wave of events in Algeria, the Sudan, and in Lebanon. And so I was writing these comments and trying to take stock of some of these conceptual apparatuses that we've inherited and are working through and with, and perhaps against. And I wanted to use these events to revisit this question of how colonial modernity continues to inhabit our epistemological and political frameworks. And one of the things that I was trying to process is how decoloniality operates as a kind of political horizon. I'll refer to it today as a kind of impulse. But it nevertheless is embedded in these historical structures of modernity that have shaped the languages that we use as we are making claims for alternative epistemologies and political futures. So I will be talking about the decolonial as an impulse rather than as an already existing framework. And I'll also say that I am a historian, so my idea of decolonization is one that is rooted in attempts to win sovereignty and an anti-colonial struggle. And so, I realize that this is a kind of low bar for this discussion that has now gone other places, but I hope to show that this historical experience still has important things to teach us about the paradoxes and complexities that we face in the present. So I'd like to start with this slide, which I think illustrates some of the points I'm getting at. You see a figure that is representing the Algerian Hirak, or popular uprising, that began in February 2019. And inscribed on the body are all of these terms and realities that continue to persist, that persist after 1962 and historical decolonization, and indeed persist after the Hirak. Humiliation, corruption, high prices, unemployment, and also this notion of hogra, which has come to capture the political imagination in the Maghreb with the Hirak, not only in Algeria, but Morocco as well as in Tunisia. And so despite the fact that he is looking very defeated and holding up the symbols of historical decolonization, you can see him looking off into the future at the monument to the martyrs of the revolution, the Maqam al-Shahid, and holding the flag. And so one of the things that I've been wrestling with is this necessary referent of liberation, which in the Algerian case is, of course, 1962, even as the promises of that emancipation have been questioned and indeed have been made difficult to celebrate for various reasons. And I think that processing decoloniality is one that does not work as well in terms of epistemic recovery in the Algerian case. I treat it as a radicalizing impulse, but with two important caveats that I think are also bound up in this image. One is that it inevitably comes up against what I'm calling the intractability of colonial modernity on the one hand, and also the existence of an internal colonialism. In this case, it's quite specific to the Algerian context, in that the regime is speaking a language of legitimacy that was inherited from decolonization itself in 1962. And so I find this more useful than thinking about the decolonial as a recovered exteriority, and I want to thank the other panels that kind of emboldened me to make these claims. I think we've had some really interesting discussions the past few days. To start with the first point, as a number of historians have argued, the most essential contours of individual subjectivity and collective identity, and this is also bound up with notions of Arabness, Arab identity, and the notion of the Nahda itself. So these three figures that are depicted here, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Mohammed Rashid Rida, and Mohammed Abdu, are the kind of quintessential figures of the Nahda. And I think without going back to the Nahda, it's very difficult to process what the coloniality of power means in the Middle East and North Africa. And so I promised I wouldn't give a lecture. I was just saying I'm in teaching mode right now. I taught, got on a flight, I'm going back to teach, but this will not be a lecture on the Nahda. But these thinkers attempted to reconcile an undoubtedly Eurocentric modernity with their own notions of tradition and authenticity. And they didn't engage with Enlightenment notions because they lacked original thought, of course. They felt compelled to do so because of the onslaught of imperial power. And in these attempts to make Western science or technology compatible with Islam is the moment that we see a kind of coloniality of power emerging in the region. This period is also one in which the material realities of empire, the train, the telegraph, the European calendar, brought Western modernity and notions of Western temporality into the daily lives of people in the region. And so, as scholars of this process have noted, the introduction of technological modernity paradoxically also introduced a fetishism of modernity, so that despite the alleged separation of Western power and Arab culture or authenticity, indeed the two only made sense in relationship to one another. A self-evident realm of culture or authenticity could only be legible as a foil against technological modernity, and this is something I discuss in my work through the tropes of Homo Islamicus and Homo economicus. And so one commentator writing on the Nahda says that to decolonize the Nahda, and this I'm quoting from Stephen Shiha here, says that there's no point in trying to recover a phantasmic socius. That there's no point in trying to find the desperately desired, lost, or displaced selfhood. And instead, he directs us to, quote, search for methods that probe, if not only through association and representational reconstruction, the latent histories of the manifest present and its surfaces. So having done a kind of quick historical gloss on the Nahda, I'd like to think also about questions of indigeneity and how they get translated into the region. And one of the things that I think worries me is the ways in which questions of indigeneity can get caught up in nativist discourses. And we know to be careful with the indigenous in the region. We've already talked about Israel-Palestine or Kashmir, but there are a number of cases in which looking for indigeneity perhaps has political effects that are not part of an emancipatory horizon that we're invested in. So I'll just give one quick example of this, which is that at the same moment that the Nahda is consolidating Arabness as a sign of authenticity, for certain groups in the region, and one can think about the Kurds or the Berbers, which both come to mind, this creeping sense of nationalism was experienced as a harbinger of the violently centralizing tendencies of the modern nation state. And so currently there are, here I've got a slide. This is the movement, a symbol of the movement for the self-determination of Kabylia. And what I find fascinating about this, it's a small group, but they have used indigeneity to make claims not only for a more diverse notion of national culture and religion, but also to cast Arabs as colonizers or settlers. And here they're referencing, of course, the 7th century arrival or conquest, quote unquote, of the Maghreb. And so what's interesting about casting the 7th century conquest as settlers or a colonial endeavor is that it marries in a very uncomfortable way with French colonial discourses about the particularity of the Berbers or them being more civilized than the Arab inhabitants, something that has been discussed a lot in the French historiography around the Kabyle myth, entre guillemets, in quotations. And so here are some of the political, I think, uneasiness that I have around some of these concepts. And so in this case, even though there is a decolonial impulse against the centralizing tendencies of the nation state, one sees that it's being cast or communicated through the structures and languages of modernity rather than finding a place outside of it, I would argue. And this reflection on the contemporary is going to bring me back to something I'm actually working on at the moment, and that is Algerian critiques of Frantz Fanon after 1962. This is an article I'm working on, and fascinatingly for me, these debates, which often are occurring in Arabic, have fallen out of the critical discussion of Fanon as a decolonial intellectual. Algerians had a lot to say about how Fanon was being written about just years after they received or won independence. They were uncomfortable with the fact that Fanon was being made into the theorist of the Algerian Revolution. And they were engaged in a process of continuing to deepen the decolonization that they had won. They were very self-conscious about the fact that decolonization did not end in 1962. And so one of the critiques that emerged of Fanon was that Fanon himself was located within a number of Western models and epistemologies. One of Fanon's colleagues who worked with him at Al-Mujahid, the journal of the FLN, wrote that indeed this notion that Fanon was the spokesperson of the revolution was problematic precisely because they had all worked together as an editorial team at the time. Mohammed al-Milli highlighted the absence of references to Algerian history in Fanon's writings. He argued that the notion of a clean break with the past was actually proof of the weight of epistemological frameworks coming out of Europe. And indeed, they wanted very much to remind people that it was the Algerian Revolution that questioned Fanon's humanism and not Fanon's humanism that somehow scripted the revolution. Other Algerian interlocutors pointed out that Fanon was not Muslim, he didn't speak Arabic, and that it was difficult for Fanon, given his background, to consider Islam as a political force. And he wrote letters back and forth with Ali Shariati about this. Other decolonial intellectuals like Malik Ben Nabi also had critiques. And so my point here is not at all to advocate, to pronounce a kind of bottom line or a new reading of Fanon. That's been done. I imagine, like most people in this room, Fanon was hugely important to the way I think and the way I understand race and capitalism and decolonization. But what I do want to highlight, and what I do find interesting, is that for these thinkers, at least, Fanon could not escape from a colonial matrix of modernity. He couldn't get out of these paradoxes, even as he was harnessing them to a radical project of decolonization. And so once again here, I think we can talk about a decolonial impulse, though it necessarily has to engage with the coordinates of Western modernity, even as it's trying to upend those structures. So to conclude, I would like to return to where I started and go back to contemporary politics and to touch briefly on this kind of double bind of internal colonialism, or what happens when you have a regime that claims to be speaking in the language of decolonization. And I think we talked about this a little bit last night as well. One of the slogans of the Hirak that protesters were using was Klitu al-Bilad, they ate the country. That literally, the country and its resources has been eaten up by the regime. I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to perhaps skip over some of this. But this is one of the things that protesters have had to deal with, which is to push back and to radicalize the promises of decolonization against the FLN's attempt to say that work was done by us, and therefore any horizon of revolution has to end. The buck kind of stops here. And something that we talked about yesterday in terms of decentering the colonial, this came up with India. Can we talk about something outside of just the metropole and colonial framework? And so what I wanted to show, and I'm sorry I don't have time for the video, but one of the main clips that came to define the movement was the slogan of Yet Nahuga, which is the Algerian equivalent of An-Nas yurid isqat an-nizam, or the people want the fall of the regime. But the way that this slogan came about, I find fascinating, and I think also speaks to this decolonial impulse and the multiple structures of modernity that include Arabic and Fusha and kinds of language. Arabic is not outside of colonial modernity. So to tell the story briefly, the day that Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned, there was a news reporter on the streets of Algiers. She was speaking in Fusha, in kind of modern standard Arabic, and she was saying how everybody was celebrating, the revolution had completed, and this was kind of the end of the story. Everybody was delighted. And this young man, completely irreverently, pushes her out of her own news show, live broadcast, and says, "You're getting the story wrong. This is not what's happening." And again, this is not France 24. This is I think it was Sky News. So this is not a question of representation vis-a-vis France. And he said, "We know that the story has not been completed. They're replacing one set of pawns with another." And then she reproaches him for not speaking Arabic, which is funny because, of course, they are both speaking Arabic, but he's speaking Algerian Arabic. And she keeps saying, "Bil-Arabiyya min fadlak," and he gets so frustrated and finally says, he says, "Ma nafhamsh al-Arabiyya, hadil al-Arabiyya inta'na." Like, I don't understand Arabic, this is our Arabic. And so here, the struggle is not necessarily between France as a neo-colonial language, which of course it is, but indeed around the question of modernity in Arabic among countries in the Middle East. And so this has also been part of the story of the Hirak. I don't have time to get into the other poster I wanted to talk about, but my hope was that it would show another double bind of this decolonial impulse, which is the incredibly sovereignist recourse to the nation state, which is both a problem in terms of this unitary structure that has been hegemonic, but also one that is the legacy of 1962. And so I think there are interesting ways we can talk about in the Q&A, if it's interesting to folks, about what does one do with that kind of status legacy in a decolonial framework, or is that even the right set of terms to be talking about this in? So my last slide here has to do with what happens to these decolonial figures after independence and precisely during the Hirak. So I wanted to show you one reappropriation, I would say, of Fanon during the Hirak, and it says, each generation must discover its mission, accomplish it, or commit an act of treason with it. And on the other side is Malik Ben Nabi, who has been a much commented figure in recent years. And he, I'm trying to find my place here. I missed a page. And so the sign here of Ben Nabi's translates as, "This is divine law, change yourself and you will change history." So what's interesting to me here is that both of these signs are being used in very different ways than they had been invoked in the 1960s and 1970s. The Fanon quote is actually outside of the ENS, which is a technocratic elite institution in Algiers, and the Ben Nabi quote has been has been used to make a host of polemical observations about the role of Islam and Islamism in the Iraq. So again, we're not just reconstituting or revisiting figures, they're being used in fundamentally new ways. So just to conclude, I was thinking about one of the conversations around community and how we discuss community, and it occurred to me that in the Algerian case and in many revolutionary situations in the Middle East, it's the question of the shab. Who are the people? When we're talking about the people, whose name are we speaking in and who constitutes that? And here, this was one of the slogans of the Algerian Revolution, only one hero, the people, which kept coming back again and again during the Iraq. And so these concepts that are inherited from decolonization with all of its problematic structures and statism and sovereignist impulses are nevertheless being worked through in interesting ways. But what I hope to suggest is that this notion of colonial modernity is indeed intractable, that there is no clear outside to it, and that at least when I am looking as a historian at the Nahda, at readings of Fanon in the 1960s and 1970s, or at the Iraq, what I'm observing are creative ways of disrupting those categories and structures rather than a return to some kind of outside or notion of authenticity that makes sense in and of itself. Thank you.
Muriam, thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand over to Walter Mignolo, who's joining us virtually from Duke University. Walter, can you hear us? I think you're muted. It says he's talking. Walter, I think you're muted. And your video needs to be activated. It's early in the morning there. Is he with us? Walter, can you help me? Can you hear me? You need to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Welcome. We can hear you. You can proceed.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay. Can you hear me and can you see the
You are with
the
us.
slide?
You are with us. You haven't shared your screen yet.
I didn't share my screen yet. I have a problem here. Let me see what is going
Walter,
on
we can
here.
try sharing the screen from this side. So if you want to proceed.
Right, but the question is that I lost my there. Okay.
There we
Now,
go. Okay, your screen has
see it?
shared.
hello?
Yes, we can hear you. You can proceed. Your screen is shared with us.
I did?
Walter, can you hear us?
Can you see it or not?
We can see clearly your screen has been shared and you can proceed.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, and listening to Muriam, I really regret that I am not there to participate in the conversation. So probably what I have to say will be redundant in relation to what has been discussed in the past 2 days. But anyhow, I will share some basic ideas about what coloniality means in this part of the world. So I will focus on conceptual elucidation, as a philosopher used to say, the analytic philosophy used to say. So let me see now how we proceed to move to the next. Okay. In general, Samantha Fong, a graduate student at Duke Divinity School, defined coloniality in a very clear and concise way. Coloniality is not over, it is all over. And in relation to Muriam said, of course, we are all in the colonial metric of power. There is no outside of the colonial metric of power. Decoloniality will no longer be necessary once the colonial metric of power is ended or was transformed or anything else. But for the time being, our idea is that our sense, more than our idea, is that it's like the movie The Matrix. We are all in the Matrix. You take the blue or the red pill. So coloniality for us, and I am talking from the history of the Americas, especially from South America and the Ibero-America, and after 1500, but, and I apologize for the typos, but this is the kind of the concept of coloniality was introduced by Aníbal Quijano in 1992. So coloniality is already a decolonial concept. Coloniality is a decolonial concept that emerged in the third world to kind of address issues that emerge in the third world and not in Europe. In that sense, modernity is a modern European concept, but modernity coloniality, as we write, is also a decolonial concept. So how did coloniality come into being? It's a long history of the kind of the theoretical imperatives. Why do we need concepts? Why do we need narratives that are not narrative that we need narrative from the experience, the historical experience, that are not covered, or better yet, are silenced by the narrative of modernity. So for a long time, the narratives that we have on the so-called discovery of America were Spanish or European narrative, until in 1958, Edmundo O'Gorman, a Mexican philosopher of history, said, well, America was not discovered because there was no America before 50. America was invented. So this is a kind of the context in which Quijano was thinking. From the 16th century, Guamán Poma de Ayala, that in retrospect, we can say that Guamán Poma de Ayala is the first political theoretical decolonial treatise in this part of the world, until Jose Carlos Mariátegui, which is a kind of a Marxist that was expelled from the PC because he was talking about land, and he was talking about indigenous, and he was talking about race. And so the Orthodox Marxists kind of put him aside. So in his landmark article, Coloniality and Modernity Rationality, and I'm talking about one of those who follow Quijano. So we are several, and you can say that we are kind of a small school of thought that emerged from this and other work by Quijano. So in that article, Quijano conceived coloniality as the darker side of modernity. And modernity, in the term of rationality, he didn't talk much about this, but the rationality will be just not the rationality of the 18th century, but the theological rationality of St. Thomas, when St. Thomas kind of rearticulate Aristotle into the theological Christian doctrine. And that, as we know, and as several have been saying, the Enlightenment, what the Enlightenment did was a kind of secularize and de-God God, but the apparatus, the system of rationality inherited by Christianity, Western Christianity, was kind of rearticulated. So on the one hand, we have a kind of imperial settler colonialism with this extramural. In that case, the Spanish and the Portuguese were kind of here for almost 3 centuries. But then the independence happened here in the South America, well, in the North American in 1776, the Haitian Revolution, 1804. But the independence, what after the Cold War in Asian Africa were called decolonization, and here we're called independence or revolution. Revolution in the kind of Haiti, and in the case of Haiti and the US revolution. What ended up, leaving Haiti aside, because it's a little bit more complex. I have written about that, but I won't go here into detail because I have only 20 minutes. This is when kind of internal colonialism emerged, and internal colonialism means, and Muriam was referring to that in North Africa, is that the native or the indigenous elite that depends on what region of the world, if it's Asia or it's Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. Internal colonialism was, and Fanon was seeing that the kind of the comprador elite will take over and do this exactly the same that the settler, the imperial, the extramural settler was doing, but they were doing themselves. So they didn't question, neither in South America, nor in Asia, nor in Africa, the political and economic conceptualization of the state, conceptualization of the economy, and what we can call the cultural dimension, education, although political theory and political economy are also part of the culture. So internal colonialism was the second stage. So coloniality remained. Colonialism, Spanish and Portuguese colonialism were over, but coloniality was kind of rearticulated. So on the other hand, we have what we can describe as distant colonialism or coloniality without settler. And that is what began to happen. For example, what happened to China with the Opium War. I mean, China was never colonized like India, but didn't escape coloniality. And after the closing of the decolonial struggles in Africa and Asia, let's say by 1980, more or less, United States kind of came as a kind of the leader in coloniality without colonialism. So United States didn't need a settler anymore. They have military bases, they have control of the finances, control of the media, and diplomacy. Diplomacy when it works, if not by other means. No? So these three type of colonialism, settler colonialism, and coloniality without settler colonialism are different historical moments in different parts of the world since 1500. So what all these have in common is the logic of coloniality. So what Quijano named coloniality, described as coloniality, is the underlying logic of all colonialism from 1500 to today in different modalities, imperial, settler, internal colonialism, and coloniality or colonialism without settler. So how this happened is that together with this kind of invasion and settling and restructuring of education of banks or infrastructure, was always a persuasive narrative and images of salvation. So that is a kind of what we call the rhetoric of modernity. The logic of coloniality goes hidden and justified by the rhetoric of modernity. And the rhetoric of modernity is the rhetoric of salvation. Salvation by conversion in the early period, 16th, 17th century, by progress and civilization, the French and the British, development and modernization, United States after World War II, and market democracy, the kind of the neoliberal rearticulation of the long history of coloniality, which now is, I won't have time to develop that, but the question is that from 1500 to 2000, modernity coloniality was created, managed by North Atlantic European empire, even if they were kind of fighting within themselves. But since 2000, more or less, the North Atlantic can no longer control the colonial metric of power. And that kind of explains a lot of disorder and problem and tension we have today, including Ukraine. So a logic of domination, exploitation, and oppression is justified by the narrative and images of salvation, of democracy, of human rights. And I am not talking about against democracy or human rights. I am just calling the attention that democracy and human rights are being used to justify oppression, invasion, domination, expropriation. So we, after Quijano, describe and explain the narrative of salvation as the rhetoric of modernity. And the second, the logic of exploitation, domination, and oppression, the logic of coloniality. So we write modernity, coloniality. There is no modernity without coloniality from day one. That is our, I think this is probably our kind of more basic premise. So let's take another step in the cascade of concepts that are unfolding still today from the concept of coloniality as the darker side of Western modernity. And I again apologize for the typo. So coloniality in our kind of theory conceptualization is the generic term for coloniality of power and for the colonial metric of power. So coloniality of power names a particular will to power, the colonial will to power. What Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were talking about was the modern will to power. But the question is that the assumed universality of the locus of enunciation and of the enunciated kind of was not necessary for Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and many others, not to qualify, to put a modifier of what they are talking about. So what we are doing with this kind of decolonial narrative is kind of reduce Eurocentrism in the sense of North Atlantic universal to their own well-deserved side. So they deserve to be what they are, but they cannot pretend anymore to be valid, universal for everybody. So we reduce, with this, we reduce, as I said, Eurocentrism to its own well-deserved side. So the colonial matrix of power then is a tool, the instrument, or should they say the technology of the colonial will to power. It came to be in the colonial matrix of power in the 16th century, and it's well and alive today. As I said before, coloniality is all over, and maybe around for a while. Coloniality is not over, it's all over, as said at the beginning. I don't have time to go into detail into the colonial matrix of power. Was a lot, many of us have written and described it, and in my latest book, the introduction, I devote a lot of time to describe it in detail. So the point here is that the colonial matrix of power is moved by this kind of energy of will to power that is domination, by the logic of coloniality, that's exploitation and multiple oppression, and conflicts. That cannot be avoidable. Somebody trying to dominate, exploit, and oppress, well, there will be conflict. And the conflicts since the 16th century until today are numerous. So decoloniality, as we understand it, is one manifestation of this conflict today, and in the way that we can tell the story of decolonial, I don't remember the colonial impulses that, as Muriam will say, we call the colonial option, because the decolonial is an option among different existing options. So the decoloniality is one of the manifestations arising from the conflicts provoked by the dupla modernity coloniality. So, and where is decoloniality in this picture? Decoloniality is everything I just said. In other words, what I just said was said by thinking decolonially. And that's what I said at the beginning when I said that coloniality is always already a decolonial concept. Like the unconscious is always already a psychoanalytic concept. There is no unconscious without psychoanalysis, and there is no psychoanalysis without unconscious, and you can say a perspective. There is no coloniality without conceiving it decolonially, and there is no decoloniality without conceiving coloniality and coloniality of power and colonial nature of power. By the time Quijano launched the concept of coloniality, the splendors and misery of decolonization during the Cold War were already clear, and Muriam talked about that. While the building of nation state by the natives elite is problematic, the decolonial thinking legacies are not only undeniable, but fundamental for today, when coloniality is still when alive. And by that I mean Fanon, I mean Cabral, I mean Biko, I mean Gandhi, I mean all these people who produce thought beyond or on top of kind of fighting decolonially, fighting the decolonial struggle to send the settler home. In this context, he kind of focused on the coloniality of knowledge as the fundamental domain of the colonial matrix of power. Consequently, in '92, everybody was already seeing that the nation state, the modern colonial nation state, was not working for the reason we mentioned before, that kind of the elite took over, and decolonization was no longer conceivable as a task, a state-related politics. So Quijano said decolonization as epistemological reconstitution. Well, that is a lot to talk about, but since 1992, we have been focusing on the question of knowledge and knowing and understanding. In that context, the rhetoric of modernity, the logic of coloniality generated what we are talking today, the grammar of decoloniality. And what is important here, and I refer to Muriam talk because it's very clear about what I wanted to say. While modernity, coloniality, 1500, 2000, was the entire planet endured the kind of the expansion of Europe and Eurocentrism at the different moments and a different strategy, from the Spanish and Portuguese to the French and the British and the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. So we all in the planet kind of endure the kind of the Eurocentrism and the Western expansion, but in a different local histories. And that is what is important today, and that again, I refer to Muriam, because I mean, decoloniality, the way you think decoloniality in the Maghreb or in sub-Saharan Africa cannot be the same way that we think in decoloniality and do decoloniality in the Americas, and the way we talk about and the way we kind of address the colonial reconstitution. So the grammar of decoloniality is no longer universal, it's pluriversal, and that's what we mean by pluriversality. While the rhetoric of modernity is different in the surface, but also always based on the abstract North Atlantic universal. So, and I will just end here because I think I am on my 20 minutes. So the last point I would like to make is the extension of the decolonial task to epistemological and aesthetic reconstitutions. Quijano, he mentioned aesthetics earlier, but he didn't develop this aspect. But since the beginning, when he began to 92 reconstitution, epistemological reconstitution, he was always referring to the control and management of knowledge is the control and management of subjectivity. He was coming from Marxism also, but at some point he began to see that you cannot avoid talking about the coloniality of knowledge without talking about the coloniality of subjectivity. And since the subjectivity in the modern kind of division of labor was taken care by the invention of aesthetic in the 18th century, so we began to work about 10 years ago about epistemological and aesthetic reconstitution. And in order to do that, that is very complex also because there is a lot of kind of concepts that are being thrown out in the discussion, but to summarize, to give you a better idea what I mean is the basic decolonial tasks are decolonizing epistemology to liberate gnoseology. Why? Because epistemology was kind of limited to, since Aristotle, when Aristotle distinguished epistemology from doxa, but also from gnosis. Gnosis was a general sense of knowing, and I would say that epistemology and doxa are two manifestations of gnoseology. And decolonization of aesthetics to liberate aesthesis. And aesthesis refers to the sensing and emotion and etc. And I will notice that Aristotle didn't talk much. He mentioned aesthesis in the Poetics, but he doesn't elaborate. But he elaborates on aesthesis in the treatise called the Anima, which is kind of the subjectivity. So I hope that I give you an idea of where we stand in this part of the world with the question of coloniality, modernity, decoloniality, and we can elaborate or just discuss more in the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter. I'm going to hand over immediately to Françoise Vergès, my colleague at the Africa Institute.
I cannot hear you, but I understand you very well.
Is he still connected?
Oh,
Yes, yes.
Françoise?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm afraid my talk will be much less conceptual. But, however, okay. There have been moments when it has been difficult to overcome a sense of dread and powerlessness caused by the pandemic and the daily assault of racial capitalism, genocide, colonial occupation, dispossession, wars, femicide, imperialism, xenophobic nationalism, fascism, Islamophobia, neoliberal decolonization, performative anti-racism, liberal multiculturalism. When I experience this feeling, I tell myself that I need to look the monster in the face, at all its feature, all its configuration, heinous and seductive, and not be petrified, either by fear or by seduction, and to transform dread into anger, in the desire to fight back, into a place to conspire. Where is the weak angle of the monster? Where to throw the stone? How to organize? But it has not been like that for centuries for most of the people. Has not dystopia been made into a way of life for billions of people? But also, has not utopian thinking, indigenous anarchism, abolitionism, fight, always been there? I carefully look then at the way in which visual culture normalizes vulnerabilities. I take visual culture to mean what Anna Rabindan Kesson has described in her book, Black Bodies, White Gold, as, and I quote, it does not just represent or mirror this economic operation of racial capitalism, nor it is simply a product of them, but it forms part of the economic structure that commodify and still commodify blackness. And she had, I quote, economic relations structure not only social interaction, but also the way we see and perceive each other. We are trained not to see what is under our eyes, or to look away from permanent war, to look away from settler colonialism, to look away from racism, to look away from class war. How then do we unlearn the way we see so that we learn again? How do we retrain our senses so that we see and listen with care? Racism, Ruth Wilson Gilmore has written, is, I quote, the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, in distinct yet densely connected political geography. Racial capitalism, she had, is a technology of anti-relationality. Collective life in humanity, in separated and then reconnected in ways that feed the production of capital and wealth. Capitalism applies a structural selectivity, Nicolas Poulanzas has added. It is a structural selectivity, this organization of vulnerability to premature death that has been working for a while. What accounts for difference in this fabrication? How are they normalized? What is the visual culture of their normalization? How is resistance affirmed, and what is its vocabulary, its visual cultures? I will present some feature of the monster and then evoke practice of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others call life in rehearsal. This historical geography of the future, building what feminist activist and author Robin Maynard has called constellation of co-resistance that affirm life and world-making in a time of acute racial violence. It can mean the opening of a university, of school and cultural center in favelas, township, and poor neighborhood, collecting memory and archives, organizing march and protests, creating refuge and sanctuary, where to read, where to rest, where to think together, where to maroon, where to organize, where to create underground place to drink, to dream, to sing, to read poetry, to have fun, to care about each other, to sing collectively, to mourn together, to prepare counterattack, to imagine political repair, to overcome fear and rehearse life. Because while, as Christina Sharp has written, we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to an overwhelming force, we are not only known to ourselves and to each other by that force. So some facets of the monster that intersect and deeply, entangle temporality also. I'm not, but I'm going to give you some generalization. What I mean by entangled temporality is that the past is still there, the present, we are barely repairing the past, and we need to repair the future as we are talking because it's being destroyed as we speak. So the first one is the afterlife of slavery. And no region in the world escaped the afterlife of slavery, none. It is not about the fact that you have had slavery. It's about the way in which slavery has structured the world. It's a push for international law of commerce, to how to link private property with the idea of citizenship, and of course, of racism. And this afterlife of slavery, which has been discussed already, I will just talk about the way in which it's aggravated by colonialism and capitalism, and here, following many of us, what some of us do not call the Anthropocene, but racial capitalocene or plantatoriocene. The irreversible impact of climate collapse, the drought, the flood, the heat wave, the dying forest, the anger, the ill health and poverty. Today, more than 3 billion people are already living in greater vulnerability. Food and water insecurity are greater in Africa, Asia, and South and Central America. And women and girls are the most affected by the lack of water. Zoonoses are multiplying because, as the Chinese leftist group Chuang has written, capitalism production is founded on an ecological rift. Its civilization has always been a machine for extermination. Agro-extractivist capitalism continued its destructive work of the plantatoriocene, structuring the space of vulnerability in the plantation of sugar, palm oil, soy, and eucalyptus in Africa, Asia, and South America, where rape and violence remain the tool of domination. If there is perhaps a theoretical imperative today, it is to transform climate collapse into an anti-racist, abolitionist, feminist, indigenous struggle for freedom and liberation. The second feature I want to talk about this monster is the state of permanent war, the militarization of ocean and seas, and here we are, the Indian Ocean is just right there. We can think about the Sharjah Island, of course. The arm industry, bringing pollution and destruction. Remember that the first dealer is the producer and dealer is the USA, and the second is France. The visible war with their bomb, their tank, their plane, the civil population fleeing systemic violence, rape, torture, and destruction, the wounded, the mutilated, and the more silent war, bringing death by pollution, by poverty and dispossession, the war against women, queer and trans, the war against Black, brown, and indigenous people, and the criminalization of solidarity, the logic of permanent vulnerability within the racial capitalist geopolitical division accentuated by the pandemic and by the war in Africa, Middle East, and now Europe. So the multiplication of the zone of non-being. Frantz Fanon described how the line of the human operates. Above that line, the zone of being, where the full humanity of human is socially recognized through human, civil, and labor rights. Below the line is the zone of non-being, where those who are considered subhuman or non-human live, their humanity either not recognized or in question. Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter has called the figure that embodies the being, above the line, the man. The formulation, she says, of European representation of the human, which epistemologically, foreclosed way of being human otherwise, Among the many current zones of no-being, I want to talk about those created by Western politics against refugees and also the proxy of this Western country. With its visual culture and its ideology, talk about hybrid war, of the Great Replacement, which was rooted in French anti-Semitism and is now adopted around the world against Muslim, Black, and brown people. Its industry, the war, the drone, the private militia. These politics are applied every day, as we speak now. Last year, we saw it at the Belarus-Poland border, but also we see it in Slovenia, in Australia, in the Comoros Island, in the Indian Ocean, in the Greek island, in Libya, Italy, France, Turkey, in the vast maritime cemeteries that the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific has become. White supremacy normalized their death. We can just listen to what journalists were saying last week about Ukrainian refugees, I quote, this is not a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European country. We are not talking about Syrians fleeing bombing. We are talking about Europeans living in their cars that look like us. This is how consent to the racial division between good refugee and bad refugee, between good and bad migrant, is fabricated. 4, the economy of exhaustion, consubstantial to slavery, colonialism, and racial capitalism, where body, lands, rivers, sea, ocean have been and are still mined to exhaustion. Extraction required terror, enslavement, premature death, and the depletion of plant, of mine and forest and bodies of water, animal, earth, and human. The flesh and bone of the indigenous and black dead body mix with the earth in plantation and in mine, and as Catherine Yusuf has written, they were the humus of capitalism, or in the word of Diane Brand, the corpse of the humanist narrative. 5. The politics of poisoning and unbreathing and its long colonial history, creating an uninhabitable planet. The deliberate poisoning of soil and people by industry, weapon, chemical, medical, cattle, clothes, and the politic of unbreathing that lead to suffocation with no equal access to breathing. Pesticide, nuclear tests, nuclear accident, contaminate people, land, and bodies of water. In Iraq, Palestine, Congo, and elsewhere, people, land, and rivers and soil are poisoned by war. And this poisoning, as we know, lasts for generations. We can just, think of Vietnam, what's happening still in Vietnam with the Orange Agent. A racial and class line separate those who have access to clean air and clean water, to green park, to hygiene and clean neighborhood, versus those who are condemned to disease, to no access to clean air and water, to health service and to health services. According to the World Health Organization, more people are dying every year of air pollution than of any other cause. These are also the politic of unbreathing. 6, a gender fabrication of stateless non-being, the woman who joined ISIS, and whom Western media describe as unrecoverable, normalizing that eviction from humanity. Their country of citizenship does not want them back, nor their children. So in some of the camps, 60,000 women and children are living in desperate condition, and violence is systemic, and suicide is not rare among children. 7, prenatal death, by which I mean the fact that before a child is born, she or his is already condemned to premature death. Its healthy development is threatened already in the womb of the Black, indigenous, or brown woman, whose life is also threatened by poverty, lack of proper food, clean water and air, and lack of prenatal and postnatal care. Though maternal and infant rate of mortality has decreased in the world, there is still a deep divide. In the African region, the risk of a child dying before completing the first years of life is 7 times higher than in Europe. And in Nigeria, Congo, Pakistan, and Ethiopia, maternal mortality rate remain high. In the global south, or among poor minority in the north, babies are born with many more diseases than those born in white and bourgeois family, especially respiratory disease. They can't properly breathe, making them much more vulnerable to premature death as children and as adults. The lungs of the human, the lungs of the planet are under attack. We are also witnessing what Palestinian legal scholar Nadira Shahoub-Kelvorkian has called unchilding, or the understanding of children as political capital in the hand of those in power, the political work of violence designed to create, direct, govern, transform, and construct colonized children as dangerous, racialized others, enabling their eviction from the realm of childhood itself. Unchilding has a long history, as we know. It was there already under slavery. And today, as laws of protection are multiplying to protect the children, and as child psychology is making great progress, Black, brown, indigenous, Palestinian children are deprived of childhood. They are treated as adults by the carceral system, by the state, by the police, and by the army. Women and girls in the global south and women, color, and poor women in the north will be bearing the heavier burden of wars, land grabbing, and the current health and climate collapse. Why? Because nearly 40% of all women employed globally are working in the 4 most affected industries by the pandemic: hotel, restaurant, retail, and manufacturing. They account for more than 75% of all unpaid care work in the world. They constitute the majority of workers in the cleaning industry and notably in social services. The man who Sylvia Wynter described has constructed for himself and his family an imperialist way of life that structured life in the global south and in the north among minority and color, and increasingly among poor whites. What is taken for granted in the West, running water, electricity, train and work, school and hospital, avocados in winter, and cheap clothes, are the exception rather than the rule. It is, as Nick Estes has written, a way of life that requires the sacrifice of billions of people who are forced into accepting the exploitation of their land and bodies for the extraction of resources that support the good life of a few. It is a way of life that requires, as Krista Wusterschis has shown, a transnational extractivism of care. Women in the global south, and we see them every day, cleaning, cooking, doing sex work, caring for children and the elderly. My last remark on the uninterpretable world of racial capitalism and current imperialisms are about the racial division between clean and unclean and the notion of the irreparable. In the current reworking, and I mean the clean and unclean also has a long history, rooted in slavery. Just think about the slave ship. In the current reworking of the geopolitics of cleanliness, dirtiness, the invisibility of the cleaning job of women of color creates the visibility of clean home and public space. A racial and class visual culture of clean, dirty perpetuates the idea of a civilized, clean, white world versus an uncivilized, dirty, black and brown planet. The racial visual culture of cleanliness, dirtiness constructs a racial spatialization consolidated by the accumulation of image of filth and garbage in the global south, which fill the Western public with horror. The link between race, waste, and dirtiness, which have acquired even more importance with COVID-19, is tied, as I say, to slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. Among the many fabrications of that racial line, which has impact on health and which inform also green capitalist politics and white environmental thinking, I want just to have an example. In 2007, Israel started to dump untreated sewage into the sea in front of Palestine, and they produced a racialized visual culture opposing a dream vision of Mediterranean beaches versus overcrowded beach as sewage dump. In other terms, white Mediterranean versus black Arab Mediterranean. To the discourse, about the irreparable, or this idea of the irreparable, we can say with Keguro Machara that irreparable is not an and. Kaderatiak then work comes to mind. Repair, he say, is about shaping a possibility of emerging into another reality, into another more just world. When we lament the absence of a global movement of resistance, we forget the constant creation of practices of rehearsing life, or imagine decolonization with depatriarchalization. Patriarch, benevolent or not, are still patriarch. We forget the creation every day of refugee sanctuary around the world, where, again, despite the criminalization of solidarity, there is an archipelago of solidarity which is constantly fabricated. Space where to find food, warm clothes, safety, information, to have the time to read, to learn, to be trained into underground tactics, to feel protected, to be provided with fake paper, with map of route of solidarity, where are the place to avoid, where the place we will find, they will find solidarity. To reinforce constellation of co-resistance, space for developing transmission and imagination, because, I quote, imagination is necessary for thinking and breathing into the capacity of infinite alternative. And this is Ashen Crowley speaking. Place to teach self-defense. I'm thinking about the queer feminists in Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, but also, of course, of what Naminata was talking this morning of naked agency. I'm thinking of Standing Rock. I'm thinking of the strike of black cleaning women in Paris, of fight to have the right to unionize, of agricultural migrant workers in the south of Spain and Italy, of the struggle of peasant women in Morocco, and so many others. As we gather here, as we speak, many practices of life in reversal are happening. Poems are written, sung, love are circulating. The revolution will not be televised, poet Jill Scott Aaron wrote. It will not be either on Instagram or TikTok, even though we know that we should not underestimate the role in mobilizing. It will be about collective, and it is already about collective organizing, a difficult work. We have to overcome division. We have to overcome bitterness, envy, resentment, but it's also a source of joy and hope. A movement which is in the making, confronting the relentless attack of the enemy, an enemy who will fight with all the weapons at its disposal to quell any revolt. A movement that I think must also reappropriate the notion of peace, situating the notion in the long tradition of struggle against the state of permanent war. Peace, not at the interlude between two wars, this thing, this paper sign between men on a table, but peace as depatriarchalization, decolonization, demilitarization. It is a call for an abolitionist, anti-racist, decolonial feminist, queer movement for revolutionary peace, building it day after day with care and tenderness. June Jordan asked, what kind of school and what kind of street and what kind of parks and what kind of beauty and what kind of option will make love a reasonable, easy response? Our work is to answer that question. Like anyone else, during this day, I have been interested, stimulated, and moved by the image that were shown. But I decided, rather than showing an image, in a conclusion, to make you hear a Maloya. Maloya was created in the sugarcane plantation of Rainier Island, by slave capture in Madagascar and East Africa, and enriched by indentured workers from South India. It is a song, it is a poem, it is a dance, it is a ritual, it is a prayer. I heard it was a child and a teenager in the 1970s in the sugarcane field or during underground anti-colonial communist meeting, as an homage and a celebration of the Maroon and those who survived and gave us a language, a tradition of resistance. It was forbidden then, by the post-colonial French state, because it was associated with resistance to slavery, with blackness, and with Creole. Here it is performed by Firmin Viry and his family, because what we call the family is not really the family, but it's a group. It's called Firmin Viry et sa famille, singing. It's in Creole, and it just says, "What is my destiny?"
Wayo, 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 maman. Wayo, 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 papa. Wayo, wayo, wayo. Quelle destinée, moi, nana. Wayo, 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 maman. Wayo, 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 papa. Wayo, wayo, wayo. Quelle destinée, moi, nana. Wayo, 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 maman. Wayo, 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 papa. Wayo, wayo, wayo. Quelle destinée, moi, nana. Qui dit moi les morts, allez voir moi les pas morts. Allez voir moi les pas morts. Voilà la existe encore. Qui dit moi les morts, allez voir moi les pas morts. Allez voir, moi les pas morts, voilà la métisse encore. La pile la tombe fort de 6 mois, tout ça canne la passe dans mon main. Comme elle m'imagine mon demain, ça l'est comme un joli destin. La pile la tombe fort de 6 mois, tout ça canne la passe dans mon main. Comme elle m'imagine mon demain, ça l'est comme un joli destin.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Françoise.
Yeah.
I suppose I want to hand over the discussion to the floor as quickly as possible. I'll introduce 3 prompts, perhaps general comments that you might want to just think about. I mean, just given what Françoise has given us now, the kind of catastrophe of the present, if you like. I wondered, what the limits of the term concept, the strategy decoloniality might be in this moment. And so I want you to just think a little bit about the conflicting demands being placed on the term or in the name of decoloniality. At one level, a hardening of the concept. At another level, a completely capacious concept to describe, to account for the present. So just to think a little bit about those conflicting demands and what we might want to do with the term decoloniality, whether it ought to be reined in, delimited, placed within a relationship of a strategy, any number of other possibilities. But it seems to me that as a capacious term, it does get us into a lot of difficulty. The second question is directed at Walter, but I'd like to hear other views as well. I wondered about the single text by Keanu as an inaugural text to think the question of decoloniality. And I wondered what would happen if we thought decoloniality with the inaugural text of C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, Eric Williams, the Angolan historian J.E. Inikori, if we place the text of slavery as the inaugural text for discussion on decoloniality, what would happen to the concept? How would it be produced differently? Where does it take us to think this contemporary moment, this conjuncture? And then finally, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how one negotiates. Since Muriam, you raised the question of impulse. It does seem to me that the difficulty that the term decoloniality poses, and decolonization as well, and I know they're not the same thing. Walter has done a lot of work trying to distinguish between the two, between the competing demands of standpoint and what is the problem that this panel was set up to achieve, or to address, which is the elaboration of a concept. So there's the competing temporalities that are at work in the idea of decoloniality and how one resolves the problem of those competing temporalities. So just some broad, conceptual prompts, if you like, to ask us to think more carefully about what we want decoloniality what we want to undertake in the name of decoloniality in this conjuncture that was, so comprehensively laid out by Françoise. I'm going to turn over to the floor. So if there are any takers, Carlo, do you want to go first? And then Netsene.
Thank you. My question is for Walter. I really appreciated every talk, but in particular, I very much your way of unpacking, I guess, decoloniality along those different lines. And I wonder actually, can you hear me, Walter? I'm guessing not.
Walter, are you with us? Walter?
I can leave the floor to another question.
Sorry? They've asked for the technical assistance, has asked for a second before we're just trying to reconnect with Walter. Do you want to?
I'm happy to wait.
Wait, okay.
Pass the floor.
Do you want to pose your question in the meantime?
Okay, I
Thanks,
can start
Netsene.
with François because my second question was for Professor Walter. Thank you so much again for the presentation for the 3 of you. Again, very insightful. But François, I want to ask you about this mapping of dispossessions, which has happened over long centuries, and the urgency that it is posing in the present. So I'm thinking about what are the possibilities of thinking about urgency but slowness, right? So I'm not asking for, I'm just thinking with you also about there is an urgency, but of course, for example, if we want to emulate the urgency of scarcity of food with the slowness of the unemployed, or the slowness of that unwaged labor within the home, which has, and I'm not thinking about it conceptually only, but also how to think this two together, and then perhaps chart out an ethics of solidarity, if you like, of building solidarity with a very slow pace, but also with urgency. Thank you.
Shall we collect 3 questions in this round? So, Carlo, Walter is back with us, so you might want to.
Thank you. Walter, can you hear the question?
Yeah,
Great.
The last one, half of it.
I'll start it again. I was just thanking you for
About
unpacking the idea
solidarity.
of decoloniality. And my question is whether you have a suggestion of how we could, alongside that unpacking, also unpack a little bit the idea of Eurocentrism, because I'm thinking that in the way I'm reading your presentation, there is this sort of grand abstract Eurocentrism concept opposing to a more granular idea of decoloniality, whereas of course I think that also Eurocentrism could be articulated in a more granular way and opposed to granular visions of decoloniality.
Thanks very much, Carlo. Walter, let's just hold for a minute before you respond. We'll take 3 questions. So is there a third taker?
Okay.
Suraj? Oh, Salah has the microphone, Suraj. And he's my boss, so. No, you go ahead. We're deferring. I was joking about about you being my boss.
Because you said boss, I have the stage now, so I may be your next boss, is what he's saying.
That's right.
Shukran, Salah, I take it on. Most seriously, thank you for the comments. My question is more specifically for Muriam, but of course, I would be very happy to hear from others. It echoes a little bit what Premesh said about the kind of divergent temporalities of the decolonial, but I also wanted you to say a little bit more about the kind of pissing contest between the post-colonial and the decolonial that is premised on something radically different happening in those two terrains, and how your provocation to think about the decolonial as both an impasse and a place of possibility will allow us to have more generative conversations rather than antagonistic ones, which I think is something that, those of us who work in post-colonial worlds, not necessarily in post-colonial studies, would love to hear more about. So whatever you fancy. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. Salah, go
okay,
for it.
I'll be very brief. Okay, my question is to Muriam, but anybody else, of course, could reflect on, including you, is because your presentation seemed to be specific to this second wave of you can call it the Arab Spring or this kind of uprising in the Arab world. And from what I understood from you earlier, that you were going to say something about Sudan, but it's okay. You could mention it and compare it. But you stuck to the, perhaps because of time constraints. But my question is that you presented this a series of critique of Fanon, and I wasn't sure how it relates to the subject of what's happening in Algeria today, because lots of people criticize Fanon as an outsider and so forth. I don't think, and you hear this sort that he came to Algeria looking for blackness, found these people were white, as if his ignorance of the Algerian situation. He was there as part of the colonizer system or the colonial system, but he chose to side with the Algerian Revolution and became part of it and so forth. But so, I take it sometime with a grain of salt to understand what is it that means. It happened in the context of Egypt and other places where there are people of supposedly foreign descent who are part of, let's say, the leftist movement. There was always these accusations. Henry Curiel is one of them in the context of Egypt, for example. So that is the one question. The second is the challenge, it seems like maybe I got you wrong, is that you're looking at the uprising in Algeria today as part of series of uprising, but from the outside. The question from inside is the challenge of what happened to liberation movement when they take power, and that's the challenge of the FLN. It also repeated in the case of South Africa, and at the ANC. The good thing is that in the context of South Africa, there's a multi-party system. There is a constitution there, and so things move differently. But it was the same challenge. In the context of FLN, there is the issue of what is the alternative. In the uprising today, and that's the challenge in Sudan, in Tunisia, in many places, is that there seems to be an anger against organized parties. So the challenge becomes, okay, how do you transform a system without a party? Because one of the essential aspects of a democratic change is to have a multi-party system and organize civil society. And when that is lacking, that would lead to this kind of, the energy that's invested in the revolution get decimated, because there is one side, the FLN, that's highly organized. Now maybe they're cronies, maybe they're very corrupt, but they're organized as a party in one way or another. But on the other side, that lack of unity, lack of organizing, or minimum, as in the context of Sudan, we learned through many experiences, there should be an alliance of a minimum agreement on certain things that can lead to a transition. Without that, you cannot. The energy now in Sudan is under threat in terms of being decimated if it didn't lead to that kind of an agreement on an alliance, a larger front that can help the transition. Sorry, just...
No, thank you, Salah. That's great. That's there are 4 really chewy questions. So, Muriam, do you want to get us started, and then we'll go in order of the presentations?
Sure. I'm not sure I can do justice to all of those. I'm going to start with this. Well, I'm bad at pissing contests, Anjali. I always lose. So that's certainly not my endeavor today, and hopefully was not the spirit of my paper. But I think there's a few ways in which looking for, and I understand we're always in the matrix, that was not my point either. The question is that even if we are understanding there's no outside, we are trained, or perhaps asking students to be trained, to look for an exteriority, to look for examples of indigeneity, according to what we feel that indigeneity should look like. And this, we'll get back to your question, Salah. I'm not Algerian, and I in no way want to give lessons or to critique activists who are there, who have been put in jail, who have been on hunger strikes. That's not, so I will get to your question, but I think it orients our attention to the wrong places at times. For example, if I'm thinking about temporality, both temporalities of the linear homogeneous time of revolution as captured by the state can coexist with a kind of redemptive, longer durée vision of uprising. And those, I think, are both necessary. And so if we privilege one, we lose sight at the ways in which the former also structures a revolutionary impulse. And so that's one way. One can also think about the kinds of authors that get taken up and the attention. So I was telling somebody at breakfast the other day here, where I've had so many lovely conversations that, I was teaching my students Edward Said. They all got very excited. I remember my contact with Said for the first time. It's a beautiful moment. And then the next class, I introduced them to Marxist critiques of Said. And that was a less beautiful moment for them. But what's interesting to me is that people like Mehdi Amal, who is a Lebanese communist who was engaged in the Algerian War, who was in Lyon for a long time, he's just being translated into English. And we see these figures as figures of mimicry or of somehow not the indigenous. When we want to look for the indigenous intellectual, we obviously, many people will look to political Islam as a tradition. And I think that that's one tradition, but I don't think it's the only tradition. And I think the other issue comes with romanticizing languages, especially with Arabic. There's a notion that Islam and Arabic are somehow exterior. What I was trying to hint at with the part about the Yatnahuga in Algeria is that Arabic itself has traditions of marginalization and standardization that are deeply complicit with the nation state and with modernity. And so I think that also becomes a challenge, is both to recognize the importance of working in certain languages, but also not to romanticize the genealogies of those languages. And I'll also say that there's a way in which, and this comes up, I think, often with graduate students who perhaps don't read the post-colonial canon anymore. They want the biggest, brightest, shiniest object for questions of neoliberal job market, especially in the US. There's a sense of a very real pressure. And so I will read statements that don't jive with my understanding of post-colonial studies as an important tradition. And so those are the ways I think that it's very important to understand, I think, the desire and the impulse for the exterior. I think that that's very generative. But it's also, as a historian, I can only see that in dialogue with these other processes, other temporalities, and other legacies of colonial violence that I don't see the externality to that. I see a working within it, and I see moments of utopian aspiration. So I will briefly, to get back to the question of the Iraq, I'm sorry I didn't discuss the Sudan. Next time, if you invite me back, I promise I will perform better on that note. But there is also a question about structuring the political field in Algeria, where many activists will say, they did have a pluralist political system since the opening in 1988. There was a civil war. The problem in Algeria is actually the plethora of political parties and the fact that, as you mentioned, people don't feel that organized politics speaks to them. And so one of the things that happened during the Iraq was attempts to structure a very fragmented political field into a certain list of demands. And they did, there were serious initiatives to do that. But I'm always put on the spot a little bit with these kinds of questions because I'm an outside observer who's not Algerian, who has a lot of respect for the courage of my comrades, many of whom I know who spent time in jail. And so I don't feel that that's my place as a critique. All I can do is offer a kind of historical analysis. But certainly the question of what do you do with these kind of populist leader-full or leader-less movements, and how will that structure going forward, that's not really something I can speak to. But I appreciate the query.
Thank you, Muriam. Walter, do you want to join us?
Yeah, glad to. Thank you for the two questions. I don't know if there is, I understood that two questions were addressed to me, and I will address those two, and then Premesh, if I miss something, you correct me. So the question of Eurocentrism. Let's say from the beginning that Eurocentrism is not a geographic, but it's an epistemological concept. But of course, it's related to the situation of Europe in the kind of geopolitical organization of the world order. But I will start briefly by unpacking Eurocentrism from Carl Schmitt, who is a European, German, Nazi. People always tell me every time I mention Schmitt, I have to say that Nazi. Okay, he was. He said that international law that was created in the 16th century, there was no international law before, was divine law, was natural law, was human law, but not international law. So international law, he said very clearly, was created to legalize European interests. So in that sense, he said, he used the word, international law was Euro-centered, meaning that was done at the benefit of Europe. So that he had any kind of problem in, he did that, he used it in a descriptive way. So from the other part of the world, the Americas, when we talk about Eurocentrism, we talk about the control of four domains of knowledge. Knowledge in itself, I mean, theology and epistemology in the 18th century, science and philosophy basically are the kind of regulation. the epistemology became the regulation of knowing and the control also of knowledge. So that's one domain. That kind of impinge on governance, because political theory, from Machiavelli, you can go back to Plato, etc., but from Machiavelli to today, to Carlo Schmitt again, is Eurocentered, right? It was not created in Zimbabwe or in Punjab or in Bolivia. If you go to economy, that we make the distinction between economy and capitalism. Capitalism is a kind of economy that became dominant and then hegemonic, and is one of the main of the colonial matrix of power. There are other forms of economy, but capitalist, and you know, Marxist and liberal share the concept of capitalism. Liberal don't like capitalism, Marxists, liberal like capitalism, Marxists don't like capitalism, but they agree that there is something called capitalism. We talk about coloniality, economic coloniality, because it's related to governance, it's related to knowledge, and the fourth domain is the concept of the human that Françoise was referring in relation to Fanon. So human with the big H is related to, is patriarchal, basically, because it has been established since the Renaissance. Human is a European concept, it's not a universal concept. So human has been established as the standard to measure race, which is already a racist concept. So racism and sexism are two aspects of patriarchy. One is kind of what we call today whiteness, and the other is heteronormativity. So those are the four domains that have been kind of regulated, controlled, defined by Western knowledge, from the university, the museum, to journalism, etc. And there is one other level, which is the level of the enunciation we don't see. So the level of enunciation, you can see how a Eurocentric function in relation to look at the institution. What are the institutions? Well, the church, the university, the museum. Who are the actors? Well, actors are people, not everybody can kind of run this institution. The actors are prepared. And what are the languages of Eurocentrism? Well, the 6 modern vernacular European languages, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, basically in the 16th, 17th century, and French, German, and English since the 18th century. So that you have a kind of a map of how kind of the constitution of modernity is Eurocentric, and the constitution of modernity destitute other languages, other knowledge, other practice of living, other kind of concept of being human, other kind of economy. So that is more or less for kind of unpacking Eurocentrism.
Walter, can I just ask us to we want to take a few questions, so if you could just keep your responses a little briefer. I'm sorry to put pressure on you.
Well, yeah, I am sorry. The kind of Eurocentrism demand a lot of, so basically, the post-colonial and the decolonial are not antagonic. I mean, I have been in conversation with Depeche for 20 years. I just wrote a long review of Sanjay's set, Beyond Reason, Postcoloniality and Social Theory. So we are not antagonistic. I mean, there are two options. There are two options based on different experience of colonialism. We have not been colonized by the British, I mean, settler colonialists, while in India, let's say, the British were the colonizer. So, and again, we talk about pluriversality, and we are not trying to kind of say we are, the decolonial is better than the post-colonial. No, I mean, and say one more thing. During 3 years, in 98, 99, and 2000, we have conversation once a year, 3 of us, Coronil, Sarah Castro and myself, and Prakash, Dipesh, and Ajay Iskaria. And the reason we got together is to understand the mutual experience of coloniality. So, so the question, the dialogue is open.
Thank you very much. Françoise, there's a question specifically directed to you from... yeah, I think you might have...
Yeah, about slowness and urgency, right? Is it? Well, for me, you know, we need always time. You need time to learn. You need a tree need time to grow. A dinner need time to be cooked. A baby need time to learn to walk. So this question for me that even, you know, you need time to organize, even a protest, a march. I mean, everything is, you know, so for me, there is no contradiction between the fact of like urgency of fighting back and the time that is needed to even, for instance, you know, organize a march or a protest. You need to have written everything, you know, or what one instance we saw with Laminata, you have to have the time to write the band roll and whatever. So there is of course, there is a precipitation of things and a constant, you know, or being overwhelmed by news that, oh my God, what are we going to do, and so on and so forth. But I think that we are doing that, and we should not be caught into that time things. We need time to learn, to talk. We don't have enough time. We haven't had enough time really to push through certain questions during these 3 days. Because there is also a form of organization that we need to move to the next panel, and we move to so there is all this, which is, we need effectively to have a long time because of repetition, you know, going back to it, and this is also how I see that. So, but yes, we need to organize.
Thank you very much, Françoise. All right, let's take the next round. There are 3 hands that shot up, Suraj from the earlier round, and then we'll take... You can just say... first, can we start? Okay, Suraj.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah. Thank you for presentations. Miriam, I like really your intervention about that the intervention you made on indigeneity and nativity, and you know, and I think this is very important. And my question is, why are we preoccupied with colonial as a concept? I'm just an interest because, and as Walter Mignolo was saying, natives of European descent, you know, in his concept of, but what about people who are of not European descent yet occupy the role of a similar hegemonic power, exert. And within this pigmented idea of colonization, don't we think we will miss out important, and this is a question for the panel I'm just kind of raising, because what is the chronotope here, the time scale that defines the idea of belonging, occupier, and somebody who is in between? I was talking to Megan and Brooke, and from the indigenous communities in Australia and New Zealand, and they were saying 65,000 years. And that really speaks a lot. And I'm always wondering, what is the purpose of the scholarship, genuinely interested to focus on a time period, which is certainly influential. And then in the process of decolonization, is there a way to decolonize similar structures that operate in your own societies that might not be white, that might not be European, but yet they reproduce? In fact, Europeans might have even inspired in many ways through this. And I think one has to be genuinely self-observant of that. And when I say that, British Empire was really not really an empire. the region I come from was not colonized by Britain in India. It was ruled by a Nizam. And before British came, it was Ottoman Empire. And there is a right-wing Hindu push in India using the same logic. They are not using the word decolonization, but they want to reduce anything to do with Mughal or Ottoman, and they want to make it more native. So you see, we are in a very interesting trap of having this almost a macabre of visualizations. And I think colonization, decolonization is something that needs more specificity of chronotopes. Bakunin, the anarchist scholar, was very particular about it, and I think we somehow miss out some of the anarchist traditions that might help us think through this.
Thank you very much. Shall we move to the back?
Hi, thank you so much. Françoise, I was really moved actually by your introduction of the words vulnerability and fatigue, especially because we are constituted by our vulnerabilities and our fatigue. And in the last 3 days, I guess what I've been noticing, and I should say I'm not in academia, is the formation of certain kinds of binaries. And personally, as someone who has to process political discourse, I am exhausted by the binary. And I guess Anjali put it much more elegantly with the pissing contest. But I guess if we take the modernity as the point at which the colonial turns, and then problematize it, we see modernity as this kind of aesthetic bleaching of a pre-colonial history. And then in the post-colonial moment, at least in India, where I come from, we find ourselves back in a kind of pre-colonial context, just like Suraj has outlined for us here. I guess, just to keep it simple, I wonder how we move beyond the kind of binary constructs. Even pitting kind of indigeneity against a kind of industrialized modernity, to me feels slightly insufficient, because even our notions of indigeneity, perhaps as individuals in this room, are informed by the ethnographic practices of the modern subject. And modernity produced a very specific type of subjecthood. And I wonder if we're still kind of locked in its confines. So yeah, I guess that's to say, can we move beyond these binaries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A third question? No? Then I'm going to resurrect the question that I think Walter might have lost when we cut off. And I want to ask you very briefly if you could respond to the question of what would happen if your inaugural text for thinking decoloniality was not Keanu, but a text by, say, C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins. What would it do to the concept of decoloniality? Perhaps just some thoughts, if you could. So, Muriam, you want to?
Sure, thank you for that question. What a colony is not self-evident. I think it's really important that we don't repeat the myths that the British and French told themselves and that I think historians tend to reproduce. So, and of course, one could think about, to go back to Egypt and the Sudan, the Western Sahara. I mean, there are multiple, we could talk about Kashmir. There is not a monopoly. Europe doesn't have a monopoly on the concept. And indeed, there's a lot of discussions about the Ottoman Empire right now that are happening about as a colonial frontier. But what's interesting to me is the work that term does politically, especially because in Algeria was not a colony. Right? Algeria was a French department the same way Hawaii is a state of the US. So indeed, it was a move of the French to say, Algeria is not a colony, so stop talking to us about decolonization. So does that mean that if I get up here and say, well, hey folks, the action isn't with colonialism, what political work does that do? Obviously, it would then end up confirming the colonial myths of the civilizing mission. And I think also part of the issue is, going back to what Anjali was saying earlier, is that we think we have commensurate concepts, but we don't. I was rereading the essay about decolonization is not a metaphor recently with colleagues, and we all had very different ideas about what that means. What does it mean to say that it's about the land when you work on a place that's not the US? And I think what's been fantastic about being here is that we are, I feel freed from the need to constantly go back to the US as the center of theory. What does it mean to say we want the land back? What does that mean for, my family are Muhajirs in Pakistan? What would that mean? How far do we go back? Do we send the Arabs back to Saudi Arabia from Algeria? I mean, there's a real question about even World War I and what that did to population transfers. So I think we have to be careful in assuming that these discussions are commensurate and being very intentional about the political work that the category does, including the word colonialism and what that means, because as we all know, you don't need to use the word to do the work. And certainly the ways in which I think historians who are tied to a particular imperial formation tend to adopt the myths of that imperial formation to study what they do. And that's part of the trap as well. So I hope that answers some of it, but thank you for that question.
Yeah, can we move beyond binaries? I think people are doing it every day.
Hello?
Walter,
Hello?
Françoise is just responding. If you could just hold for 1 second.
But I think also that in our moment we need binaries. We need to know, that, okay, there is this, that I am on that side, I'm not on your side. So I think, for me it's not, I don't need the binary, but I don't need also to fetishize the non-binary. It's really, every time it's like to think, okay, how I'm going to fight, with whom I'm going to fight, how to fight, what it would be, what is, as I say, where to throw the stone. Do I throw the stone at the, surveillance camera, or so it's constant. For me, it's a constant work. I cannot work with saying this is that for now. And decolonization, of course, there is a question of empire and colonialism, but for me, it's also about a process against a world that was created, and whether, you have been directly colonized by the French, British, Dutch, or whomever, there is nonetheless a world that was created, very deeply by a certain that put the North, the wealth, where it is today. I mean, all what I try to say, there is nonetheless a line, a zone of, different zone of non-being. They can be created by local people who are never British, Dutch, or French, or Italian, or whatever. I agree. So this is for me, it's more how this is fabricated, how this, and I absolutely know that in the global south, you have absolute also tyrannical power. For me, it's really a question of how do we fight against injustice and inequality and racism and sexism and femicide. And I don't need to say, oh, the French were there or not, But I do know at the same time that France is a racist country. And as a racist country, occupy nonetheless a place in the world that is specific and can therefore enact with its decision have much more impact than if Cameroon or Ivory Coast are making the same decision. France or England or Germany or the US today, or are much more, what they say and what they decide. The fact that I say that France is the second producer and seller of arms in the world matters. It matters. Because they sell it, in that region, and this is destroying, and it's used to repress people. So when I say where to throw the stone, for instance, I will say, okay, one of the things, if I were in France, will be to attack the arm industry. This can be, that could be the target. There's not about binary or whatever, but where are the arm factory? How to, to do something, to stop that, because this arm is just, they're going to be sent somewhere, and they will be just, it's just destruction. There is no discussion about that. So this, for me, that's part of the decolonization process. So it does not need to be tied with historical fact. It's about oppression, class, race, gender, indigenous oppression. And I don't think about that people are necessarily good when they resist, that necessarily they're nice people. They don't need to be my friend or whatever, and they can be, and we know it's messy. When you do a movement, it's always messy. It's always very difficult to overcome all the division, but this is also our task.
Thank you very much. Walter?
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. The first point, I want to address the first intervention about conversation. I think that is absolutely essential, because decoloniality is not a universal. Decoloniality is a connector. And as we have been talking about, different parts of the world have been related to coloniality in a different way. So in relation to that, decoloniality doesn't have the private property to fight against injustice, dispossession, exploitation, etc. Decoloniality is one way of doing it. And in relation to that, the second point is the land. Well, of course, for the indigenous people in the America, land is fundamental. That doesn't mean that you have to think in terms of land in another part of the world if that is not the fundamental issue that affect the practice of living and how coloniality was affected. So that, again, the pluriversal. Decoloniality is a connector, is pluriversal, and conversation are absolutely, and it's happening. I'm having a lot of conversation with different people in different disciplines, and even not outside the university. The second thing, the chronotype. Well, when we talk about coloniality, decoloniality, it's 1500 to 2000 until today, but I won't go into detail there. Don't think coloniality doesn't have a meaning for us before 1500. Briefly, before 1500, the world order was pluricentric and non-capitalist, to use a quick term. From 1500 on, the world order began to become unipolar and capitalist. And now we are in a change of era, no longer an era of change, in which the world order is becoming multipolar at the state organization. So that is, this is our chronotype. And so the Ottoman Sultanate, I don't think that I don't call the Ottoman an empire, because the Sultan was not the emperor. Julius Caesar was not the Sultan, was an emperor. And I think that these concepts are very, very important. So in order to the way we deal with the case of the Sultanate, the Ottoman, the Mughal, the Safavid, is how the imperial difference has been created. And the imperial difference is, yes, they were not colonized by settlers, but they didn't escape coloniality, because the the Eurocentric universal control of knowledge began to demonize them in a different way. And I think that is, there was another question, Premesh?
Yeah, it's a small question about what would happen if you change the inaugural text of your discourse on decoloniality. You got 1 minute to answer that question now. If you were to put a text of slavery at the inaugural moment of your discourse on decoloniality, what does it mean?
No. That's thank you. I don't know how to explain that, but we have been dealing with what happened in the 16th century is that for the first time in the history of humanity was such a tremendous dispossession of land, and dispossession of land means need labor, and about exploitation of labor. And so African human being had been captured and enslaved. And the crucial thing there is that for the first time, there was a slavery also in Greece, but in the 16th century, human life became disposable. So you have to connect that with the bare life of Hannah Arendt and Agamben. But La Vita Nuda is a political concept where the dispensability of human life is an economic concept. Now, in the 21st century, and you see it in Europe, you see it in many parts of the world, human life continues to be disposable and is related to this dispensability in the politics of the state that we can see in relation to immigration and refugees. Much more to say, but that will be the kind of the beginning of talking about this issue.
And on that wonderful
and let me say one more.
Prophetic
we
note
have been,
about
we have been connecting the slavery with the Holocaust because there are two different moments in the colonial Mexican power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our speakers, Muriam, Françoise, and Walter, and to thank you for your questions.